Good evening, everyone, and welcome to What We're Learning at Kent District Library. Tonight's program is another adventure with Jerry Berg from the Swordsmanship Museum and Academy. This time, he's talking about the swashbuckling pirates of the Caribbean. We hope you enjoy.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest presentation from the Swordsmanship Museum and Academy through the Kent District Library. This time, we are learning about the swords and blades of the Caribbean pirates. I want to give a special thanks to the Kent District Library for hosting this presentation, and also all of us have a unified fingers crossed that the next presentation will not be one of these digital ones, but I will be able to hopefully see you all in person for the next upcoming presentation. But for now, we are going to be learning about pirates and piracy, and specifically some of the weapons that these pirates in the Caribbean used during their escapades, for lack of a better term. But we're also going to be talking about the history and the culture of these pirates too. And that's actually part of what the Swordsmanship Museum and Academy is all about. These weapons that we're going to be looking at today, be them replicas or artifacts, are not simply, yeah, cool swords, they're sharp and they kill people. They do, but they are actually more of a representation of cultures and stories from human history. The struggles that people either created or overcame are seen and represented in the construction, the use, and any other aspect of the weapons that they used, either for their livelihood, for their self-protection, or for aggression. And there is quite a lot of aggression in the story of the pirates in the Caribbean. But to start things off, we first have to set the stage. And the stage here travels all the way back to the Caribbean islands in the 1600s. Now, these Caribbean islands in the 1600s, they'll change later on, but right now the stage is set for Europe controlling these distant tropical places. Now, there are many countries that have little colonies here and there in the Caribbean, the Netherlands, England, France, but the real powerhouse in the 1600s was Spain. Spain conquered much of the New World ever since the voyages of Cristobal Colon, which we know as Christopher Columbus, in 1492. Ever since then, Spain had been continuously sending expeditions out into the New World to conquer land previously owned for centuries by native cultures, Native American cultures, Native Caribbean cultures, Native Mexican cultures in that region for centuries. Those horrible conquests, especially the infamous conquests of Hernan Cortez in 1519 through 1521, or later on in the 1500s of Francisco Pizarro conquering the Aztec Empire and the Incan Empire, respectively, those conquests wound up with immense amounts of gold and silver and other precious metals going straight into the coffers of the Spanish nobility. The Spanish Empire was incredibly wealthy, ludicrously wealthy, and they used this wealth to create a very rigid and very structured social hierarchy that also followed very strict rules and regulations for the government-controlled lands that the empire controlled. Focus that down into the Caribbean, you now have ports like Puerto Principe, Havana, and all of these other places, Panama, in the Caribbean islands that act as launching boards, diving boards for these now wealthy Spanish expeditions to contain their trade goods, their gold, and all sorts of other wealth-related items into these very tiny and relatively undefended areas. In fact, it was the isolation of these Caribbean islands that was the number one point of defense for these locations. It cost a lot to send an expedition from Europe all the way over to the New World. And Spain was relying on very few expeditions being sent from its enemies, especially places like England, to be sent over to the Caribbean. Now, don't get me wrong, there were still plenty of Spanish colonial militia organizations guarding these places. These are cities that people lived in. They were actual locations. They weren't exclusively military organizations. They were not exclusively fortified military barracks. They were actual cities. And that kind of leads into the discussion of what these colonies actually were from the perspective of the English nobility of not English, European, any nation who had a claim in the Caribbean. They saw these colonies not as necessarily equal citizens to those living in the mainland, but they saw them as commodities. These colonies, these cities that were off in these distant Caribbean islands were seen as cash cows. You put as little effort into those places as you can to maximize the output, the export that they sent back to your royal coffers, especially Spain. And that really is setting the stage, if you will, for this explosion of piracy that popped up beginning in the mid-1600s. And we're going to talk about the origin of that, going all the way through to what would be the end of the golden age of piracy in the early 1700s. So, let's begin with what one might argue to be the first true Caribbean pirate. Now, I don't want to overlook the English pirates, especially those of Sir Francis Drake in the 1500s, who captured a number of Spanish ships that were laden with gold and brought that gold back to the English crown. That they gathered those ships and that wealth through very, very, very questionable means. But it wasn't necessarily a large and well-organized community. It was just simply one or two ships that went and did that. But the success of those early ships in the 1500s really set the stage for the concept of piracy being a legitimately viable career. But jumping forward, mid-1600s, we get Spain rigidly controlling its territories through regulations and through structure, but not necessarily defending them very well, at least not as much to maintain that rigidity that they were hoping for. You get huge swaths of land that are undefended, and one of the main crops, I suppose to say crops, in these Spanish colonies would be cattle, or boar, or pigs, essentially. And they didn't necessarily need fences, because the entire island was a fence. Cows aren't going to swim to the next island. You just kind of let them go, and go gather them as you need them. Sometimes they escaped there and made large communities of pigs or cows that were wild, but nonetheless, the difference didn't really make much of a difference because Spain saw all of them as theirs. It was on Spanish territory, it was Spain's. There's a teeny little group that grows in popularity of non-Spaniards living on Spanish territory, specifically in the wilderness of these Spanish-controlled islands. This group of people, mostly French, were called the Buccaneers. Now, as the decades go on, the term buccaneer would eventually come to refer to anyone who was a pirate, especially those who were fighting against Spaniards. But these original buccaneers, or in French, boucaniers, were the first group of pirates. And their story is a fun one. And we have a very nice artifact from the 1700s that we're going to be showing you too that represents the Buccaneers appropriately. And I'm going to grab that right now. This very small knife right here is actually from the 1700s. And the lighting is horrible. I wonder if I have a light that I can put on. Here we go. That's out of batteries. This is a hunting knife. And what you can see is it has this beautiful, well-decorated cap at the end here, attached to a antler, staghorn, sometimes referred to as, knife handle with a very small blade here. This represents the buccaneers because buccaneers were hunters. They were professional, illegal hunters living on Spanish colonial land and hunting these boars and cows that Spain considered theirs, but hunting them and cooking them and curing the meat in a very special way on actually a Native American structure called a bucan. And what you would do is you would get this kind of open framed building with an enclosed roof, put the meat up in the enclosed roof, and light a very, very, very smoky fire underneath it. And that smoke would dry and cure the meat of these boar and these cows that the buccaneers would hunt, leading to what would be essentially a form of beef jerky back in the 1600s. And then these French buccaneers would sell that smoked meat to passing non-Spanish ships, English and Dutch especially. And that would be a very, very important form of nourishment and sustenance for who would essentially be enemies of Spain in Spanish territory. Needless to say, Spain did not like the buccaneers and their escapades being on their property, on their territory. So they eventually became more and more aggressive against the buccaneers and their encampments. And what they did was essentially force the buccaneers out of their territory and became much more aggressive to these what would otherwise be isolated camps. The buccaneers got together and realized that they had more numbers than they thought they did and created their own community away from Spanish control and Spanish military and much more open and unregulated. This was one of the first non-loyal to a country settlements in the Caribbean, and it led to this sort of anarchist community that would foster the development of large-scale pirates. Now, in the 1600s, you also get one very large expedition from England into the colonies, into the Caribbean. And on this expedition, which eventually gets turned around and canceled because the English nobility decided not to attack the Spanish colonies for some random political reason, you get a gentleman by the name of Captain Henry Morgan, who rose through the ranks, wasn't a captain originally, and he fell in love with this colonial lifestyle. It was rough. It was a frontier in the colonies. Whether you were a pirate or not, you were still far, far from these the highest high collar, newest forms of technology, newest forms of science over in Europe. You were in the frontier. You had to survive on your own, and he absolutely loved it. He also loved how close it was to the wealth of Spain. And what you see is Henry Morgan, a very, very skilled veteran of a lot of the wars that were happening, also coming from a military family. He was very good at gathering forces together of what would otherwise be rough military, gruff guys that would become his first pirates. So with this, and it's difficult, I'm even wearing the costume right now of a pirate from the 1700s, but let's jump back in time and let's picture a pirate from the 1600s. Aha! Here we go, a much more appropriate look for a pirate of the 1600s than what our, I guess you'd say, first impression of what a pirate would look like would be from the 1700s. Now, this is what a pirate under one of the crews or recruits of Captain Henry Morgan might look like in the mid-1600s. A lot of these guys came from military families and were sent to the New World for various reasons. Perhaps they went there to find riches. Perhaps they went there to isolate themselves because they weren't going to inherit the family farm. Or perhaps they went out there to attempt to make their fortune legitimately through merchants or farming and discovered that it wasn't going to work for them. So whatever the method would be, they find themselves in this frontier culture, failing and desperate to make enough money to survive, not only to make money to survive, but also to make money so that they could be rich. And right over there, just a few hundred miles away, a ripe Spanish colony with piles of gold just ready to be raided and plundered. And Henry Morgan was fantastic at gathering together what are essentially small armies to go and invade this Spanish territory. Now, at this point, I want to point out what a privateer is as opposed to a pirate. A pirate is someone who would go and attack that Spanish territory right there, basically forsaking any sort of alliance with any other nation and just being for himself. No government support, no connection to any sort of political body, just forsaking everything, and usually ludicrously ruthless because they only played by their own rules. As opposed to a privateer, which is essentially a pirate who remains loyal to one nation in particular, and that nation usually pays them to go out and harass, raid, or attack one of that nation's enemies. In this case, Henry Morgan was not a pirate, but a privateer. And he was a privateer in the service of England. England hired him and paid him to harass their enemies, the Spanish. And not under any other guidance other than that. He was free to do it however he wished. And he frequently did that by gathering together forces and armies and navies and attacking these Spanish settlements. And a lot of the times they were armed with weapons that you would see in mainland Europe. Now I want to clarify, most of these invasions that Henry Morgan led were land-based. He would take his naval forces and land a few miles away or on the opposite side of a nation or an island, and then have to go and tramp through the wilderness to get to the unprotected backside of those Spanish colonies. And they brought a number of weapons with them, namely this one right here. This weapon right here, it's actually short. I am inside. This would actually be probably 16 feet long. This is a weapon known as a pike. And the pike was the main weapon on battlefields in Europe for the past 150 years or more. And they were used in formations, marching together, marching in step, and following the commands of an officer or a commander, who would be saying things like forward, march, halt, about face, right face, left face, etc. And the soldiers would march together in formation, creating these pike squares, these impenetrable walls of spikes that it's very difficult to get past. And as you progress forward across the battlefield, no one is able to stop you. There were a significant number of pikemen in Henry Morgan's armies, and he frequently referenced the pike as well. But we do also have to talk about swords. One very popular type of sword that we always associate with pirates is the cutlass. And I'm going to take a quick break and focus on the cutlass right now. The cutlass is very difficult to organize and categorize because the cutlass can be anything that you want it to be. Frequently, a cutlass is referred to a curved, short, and usually stubbier type of sword frequently associated with navy or naval forces, used on ships. Frequently, people claim it's because the shorter sword was more appropriate for fighting in the close quarters of a ship as opposed to a much longer saber. But that's more of a speculation than any truth. The real answer would probably be tradition. a short curved sword has been part of naval warfare ever since the earliest I've been able to see is Italy in the 1400s. One of the southern city-states had a very prominent naval force that used curved swords. But let's take a quick moment here, and I want to dispel a couple myths, because when I picture Cutlass, or when most people picture cutlasses, they probably are picturing something that looks like this. And it does have exactly what I was referring to, a short, stubby, curved blade that has this heavily protected, usually brass, but sometimes other varieties, handguard protecting the hand. And this is what you see frequently in iconic images of pirates. But the problem is, this variety of sword, of cutlass, actually didn't pop up until the 1800s, where it had a much wider handguard like this, which, if we know our timeline, is much farther beyond the end of the golden age of piracy. The swords that the pirates were using actually looked a little bit more like this artifact that I'm going to grab here. Now, this particular artifact is probably from the 1700s, though there is no remaining marks to indicate it. Take a look at this beauty right here. This is what we would call a hunting sword, which originally means it was used for hunting trips, which were very popular in European cultures, where you would go out on your horse, usually with hounds, and go hunt down a boar or a fox or something, and you would shoot at it as you do, and in order to put it out of its misery, or after you successfully shoot it, you would need to end the animal's life, usually using a sword, because for some reason that's more noble than it is using a gun. And frequently they would bring these swords. Now, these are the swords that were made for civilian use, and thus they were mass-produced and were in high quantities, especially for those people who wanted to go to the New World. They would bring their family sword with them. And so, a couple things to note about this particular one. This particular sword has a thin blade here at the base, and it widens out a bit as it gets to the tip. It also has a very slight curve, and we'll talk about the curve later on, but I do want to focus right now on the guard. Now take a look at this. Take a look at this little guard right here. It almost provides no hand protection, as opposed to our image of the traditional pirate cutlass, which would have this huge hand guard over the front of it. So this particular one would be more appropriately, a cutlass is an appropriate term for it. I want to clarify that. It's difficult to categorize swords. Once you dive deeper into it, it's nowhere near as clear cut as we like to think. Now, a more common term for this type of sword would be a cuttoe, C-U-T-T-O-E, though there's various different spellings of it. And it would essentially, or a hunting sword is also a variety as well, but nonetheless, it would essentially refer to a light, curved sword used for fighting on foot, as opposed to a saber, which would be on horseback, or a broadsword, or various varieties of that. That would be, like I said, a short used for fighting on foot, and also with a very small, almost non-existent sometime crossguard. Bringing it more close to home, George Washington, during the Revolutionary War, actually had a cuttoe of his own, which is beautifully preserved, which has a very similar design, at least in terms of the size of the crossguard, as opposed to the size, or in relation to the size of the blade. So this was actually a much more appropriate weapon for pirates in the golden age of piracy for most of the century. They also had other varieties of dussock or clamshell cutlass, or various other varieties, if you will, of curved sword. Remember that this is the era before mass production and models of weapons. So these weapons don't have, you can't categorize them by saying, oh yeah, that's the model 1632 curved cavalry sword. It didn't work that way. Every sword was uniquely made by a swordsmith. And we've got quite a lot of other swords I want to get to, so I'm going to try to plow through this section and get to more of an appropriate 18th century pirate impression, which is the golden age of piracy. Just to wind up our story here about Henry Morgan, He led one of the largest armies of pirates ever made. And yes, I do want to clarify, the army was pirates. Henry Morgan himself might have been loyal to England, or at least on paper loyal to England. But the pirates that he recruited didn't care at all. They were at their bottom of they were at the end of their line. They just wanted wealth no matter what, and they would sacrifice all sort of morals for this. Now, that's, of course, a huge discussion for another time. We're focusing on the weapons right now, but the history of pirates and piracy is just, it's incredibly fun. I highly recommend looking into it. But Henry Morgan actually became a governor of Jamaica, which is an English colony, because of his deeds against the Spanish. So this guy, who was known for being brutal and relentless and torturing his victims, actually became a governor because of it. It was a reward, if you will. So let us take a quick pause and let's jump into the 1700s. And here we are back in the good old tricorn hat. Now, we've jumped ahead in time a little bit here, and certain things have happened since had the terror of Henry Morgan in the Caribbean and where we are now in the early 1700s. Namely, the War of Spanish Succession and the various other conflicts of the era has diminished Spain's control. They are still a heavy presence in the Caribbean, but the weakness of their internal struggle had led to a power vacuum in the Caribbean. And now, instead of the pirates fighting the Spanish like they did in Henry Morgan's era, now the main force of control was the English. And instead of Spain running its empire based on the wealth and toil of native cultures and slaves, bringing gold and minting it to make a huge pile of gold, England actually focuses on trade. And you get things like the Columbian Exchange, tremendously horrid slave conditions in the Caribbean for the sugarcane plantations and rum, molasses, and all that, and then trading those to England. England goes down to Africa, takes slaves from Africa, brings them to the New World, and then the triangle continues. And England's empire was based on trade rather than gold and strict regulations. This is also the era where you start seeing much more naval combat come into play. We talked about Henry Morgan being what I like to lovingly refer to as a land pirate. But in this era, in the 1700s, the piracy was much more common at sea. The pirates realized that with this mercantile economy, where trade in exotic goods was the name of wealth at the time, it was much more easier to attack isolated merchant ships on their trade routes rather than go for the heavily defended fortified land settlements now under English control. So you start seeing a lot more naval combat. And with that, you get some very unique types of weapons. Now, before we continue, I do want to point out there is the elephant in the room, which is this guy right here. Now, we cannot overstate how important guns and firearms were, not even to the pirates of the 1700s, but even Henry Morgan. You have matchlocks and wheellocks and schnapphanses and flintlocks that are all significant changes to the game of piracy. Now, this is especially important when you realize that pirates, when they attack, when they fight, their goal is never to kill. I mean, there's no benefit to killing people. Now, they will, of course, kill people, especially if they're fighting. But the most important thing that a pirate can do is not necessarily kill, but to capture someone and often torture them so that they will tell them where their goods are, where their hidden stash of gold or indigo or silks is hidden. And that was common in piracy across the centuries. With that in mind, how would pirates win battles? Well, the most important thing that you have to keep in mind is pirates wanted to scare their enemy into submission, and nothing is scary. I don't care how many pikes you have, a gun, which would make an especially loud kaboom, is much more terrifying than just simply a guy with a long stick walking towards you. So we cannot understate the significance of that, but this presentation is focusing on hand-to-hand bladed weapons. And we've got some other unique ones too. And one of the ones that I want to talk about especially is very much in line with the kaboom of the gun. Now, this one might have kaboom, but it is most certainly not a gun. We have this guy right here. Now, if you take a look, this one is a replica. I do want to clarify that. But it is essentially what you would see in the hands of many pirates across time, especially in the Caribbean. This is a hand grenade. And it's an early, obviously it's not like a fragmentation grenade or anything like that you see in the modern military. This is an early form of it. And what it is a cast iron round shell, though frequently pirates would improvise. They'd have glass bottles, or they'd have porcelain or pottery that they would use to throw these fire bombs, as they called them, into fortified areas or onto the deck of enemy ships. If you have an enemy ship that's ready to defend itself with its meager defenses, especially if it's a merchant ship, probably just with a small crew to defend their livelihood. If you have a few pirates with some of these, light the fuse and toss it onto the other deck, a few kabooms is really going to shake up the enemy's morale. So the hand grenade is actually very important, not necessarily because of its destructive ability, but more so because of its terror-inducing ability. Humongous explosions that really terrify an enemy ship, and hopefully, from a pirate's perspective, terrify them into submission, so you can then extract the information about gold or wealth, or possibly even recruit some of them. We also have a few other unusual weapons that are related to naval warfare. One in particular is this guy right here. This is called a boarding axe. And the boarding axe is a tool, and I want to clarify this. The main use of this weapon, if you will, is not necessarily to be a weapon. It's actually a tool. Now, this is not to say we actually have some surviving accounts of sailors using a boarding axe as a weapon. But they were on every ship. And the important thing to remember about the boarding axe is that they aren't necessarily a weapon, but a tool. And an axe can become incredibly handy when hand-to-hand fighting is engaged, or boarding, a boarding action as it's called, is engaged between two ships. Not only is this very scary when it's used as a weapon, but it can also be used to very quickly chop away burning timbers, chop enemy grappling lines, to prevent them from climbing up the ship, but also could be used if you yourself are raiding an enemy ship. Frequently people have theorized, historians of various levels have theorized that you could actually use it as a climbing tool to help you get into small openings or ports in the enemy ship. And some have also claimed it would also be good for tearing down doors when you are under decks and breaking through barricades, if the enemy has barricaded themselves in a defensible position. So it's a fascinating part, and it actually has been a part of naval warfare up until the late 1800s. So these boarding axes, I mean, the American Civil War had boarding axes. So they're actually fairly commonplace for any war that had wooden ships. Once ships became metal, this didn't really have much of a use anymore. Nonetheless, I did mention one other thing earlier, and I said cutting grappling lines. Now, I remember one more thing to remember is that the pirates would never, just like pirates didn't want to kill the enemy, the pirates also would never want to make their enemy ship, or a ship that they're attacking, I suppose, sink. If you are supposed to be gathering the goods, the merchandise that's on that enemy merchant ship, and then taking it back to port and selling it so that you can go and be debaucherous, why would you want to make the enemy ship sink? You have just simply lost all of the wealth that is on that enemy ship. So instead of firing cannons or incendiary devices at that ship, you would instead want to send your own boarding party. How do you get to your enemy ship? With this artifact right here. Now this could be many things across history. It could be a hay fork, it could be a meat hook, but it is a perfect shape for a grappling hook. And this type of device would have been carried by most pirates who would engage in boarding actions against an enemy ship. What would happen is this hook would be attached to a rope with a long length of rope attached to it, and you would swing it around on the edge of your ship, launch it at the opponent's ship, and hopefully one of these hooks would latch onto something so that when you pulled that rope taut, it would be a solid connection to the enemy ship. You would then hold it or tie it off, and then cross, or yourself or many of your compatriots would climb across and physically invade your opponent's ship. And remember, they did that on purpose. They did that because they do not want the enemy ship to sink. They want the enemy ship to survive. Either because they wanted to take the merchandise from it and then set the sailors on their way, or sometimes to take the ship itself, sometimes to take it in tow because they got such a large amount of merchandise, stolen merchandise now, from that ship that they would just tow that whole ship back into port and then sell the ship and get even more money. It was all about the profits, and their warfare tactics and combat techniques show it. So with this, we also have to talk a little bit about pirate leadership. The average pirate would not be wearing this fancy coat that I'm wearing or this silk sash. They would simply be wearing maybe a shirt and some slops as pants, maybe a vest, and probably not this fancy hat that I'm wearing either, at least not in such good condition. It was actually the captains of these crews that would be wearing this wealthy-looking garb and accoutrements. They were the representations of leadership among these pirate crews, and they had to show it. Now, pirates are not only a great representation of fighting against the system, living by your own rules, but they did, in fact, have a very small hierarchy. And these captains were the ones who really made the pirates' dreams of wealth, despite all the plunder and horridness of it, a reality. These wealthy pirates, these captains, are a side effect of the upper crust of the 1700s, the aristocrats. They had that same... Some of the pirates even wore wigs under their hats as a representation of their wealth or their noble status. One weapon became incredibly popular, not just among the aristocrats, but the pirates themselves, as a representation of their wealth and nobility. And that type of weapon is called a small sword. Very, very fascinating weapon. Let's grab one. We have a couple artifacts right here. I'm going to be grabbing this one right here on top, just because it's a little bit more decorated than the other one. This is a very fascinating weapon. This one is probably from the 1750s, made in England. You can see that it has a faceted olive pommel, as it's called, a bit of a flare here in the knuckle bow, and also, while the handle itself has degraded over the years, you can see it has a beautiful alternating line between wrapped wire and flattened wire on the grip. Beautiful scalloped guard, and then also we're looking at the blade. Now I'm going to grab the other one right now because it's in a little bit better condition for holding, but I definitely wanted to show how wealthy some of these blades could have looked. This one that I'm grabbing now is a little bit simpler, but nonetheless is very good for the talking points that we're going to be representing today. So one iconic bit that you should remember about the small sword. The thing that makes the small sword a small sword, aside from the fact of how light and dainty it is its blade. Now the blade, if you were to look down the blade, or if you were to cut a slice out of it and look at it, the blade would not be straight up and down like what you would picture an average sword with a sharp point and a sharp point on this end. The blade is actually triangular. And there's a very good reason for that. The triangular blade sacrifices all hope of a legitimate cut. This small sword would never be able to slice through anything because it simply has too fat of a blade. It's too thick. It won't be able to cut through anything because it's triangular. You can see we have one side, two side, three side. However, that design, that triangular cross-section blade, allows the small sword to have incredible strength for its small size. You could use this sword to put as much force as you possibly could against an opponent, or an opposing blade, and because it has that thick, relatively thick blade here, you actually have a lot of force and strength to push an enemy sword aside while still keeping your point on line. These small swords are very fascinating, and not only do they represent the lighter end of the military weapons in terms of weight, as well as fun, light ways of being used, they are also representation of the end of the spectrum in terms of wealth. So it's fun that wealth and a variety of sword are put together. Keep in mind, most small swords of this era are actually unique weapons. Every single one of them was uniquely made, not just because this was the era of before mass production was very popular. It was around in small forms, but it was also because it was a sign of wealth. You wanted to show off your uniqueness, your individuality, and it came off in the design of the small sword that you would have, which is very, very, very fascinating. I find that incredibly fascinating. One other point about the small sword is that this came from the earlier type of sword called a rapier, which was still common even in the 1700s among the Spanish, though it had its origins in the 1500s. The small sword itself, from the rapier to the small sword, would then go on to become the épée. And if those of you who are familiar with modern sport fencing, you'll recognize épée as one of the three types of weapons in modern sport fencing. That would be foil, épée, and saber. However, I do want to clarify the fighting style of the épée is miles apart from the style of fighting of pirates in this era. I'm going to put the small sword on hold right now, and I'm going to go talk about the other end of the spectrum in terms of weaponry. Now, we talked about the small sword being the light one. Let's talk about heavy weapons. This right here is another artifact that we have in the collection, probably a mid-1700s cutlass. Now, this particular cutlass has a few very fascinating, I guess you'd call them features about it. And we're going to start at the handle. The handle here is brass. Now, this particular one is very, very similar to a model 1747 sergeant's cutlass, which would actually be used for infantry. However, the important point to note is the handle is made out of one solid piece of brass. It is cast brass, despite the fact that it looks like it's wrapped, very similar to some of the leather handled with the wire wrap that you see, but it is one solid piece. Now, what's important to keep in mind with that is that brass is a much more rigid material than, say, the leather or the chagrin that other swords would be made of in the handle at the time. That means that this particular sword, this artifact right here, from hundreds of years ago, was constructed with stability and, I suppose you'd say, the wilderness, the rough, the wild in mind. Whether that be being part of a military force that's on campaign, or whether it be a pirate ship or a naval ship of any variety that would withstand the difficult airs of the salty sea, we're not certain. We don't have a lot of history in terms of what this particular blade was used for. We do have, and I'm not sure how well it's going to show up on the video, but as most blades, when you have an antique blade at home, this part area here, right here, the ricasso, if you will, is where you want to look to help identify it. And this one might show up in the light a little bit, not too well. We are able to identify a house, a symbol representing one of the houses of cutlery makers from the town of Solingen, Germany, on this blade. And in fact, one of our small swords as well has it. And what's really fascinating about it is the town of Solingen, Germany, has always been the sword making town for high quality blades. And so and this has been on, even today, Solingen makes high quality tableware, which is really what you would make if you want to stay afloat in a world where swords are not useful anymore for self-defense. You would go into cutlery. So Solingen, Germany, it's fun to have a connection to that. They exported their blades everywhere to every nation. Was not necessarily a German sword that had a German Solingen blade. One other feature about it, it gets thinner at the base and thicker at the tip, which allows for an accentuation of cuts. Now let's talk a little bit about the curved blades of these cutlasses. The curved blade of the cutlass has a very, very good use to it. And the origins of it actually start back in the 1500s. Actually, it starts back much earlier, Viking Age, roughly in Hungary, or the region that would become Hungary. But nonetheless, we're going to very much simplify the benefit of a curved sword. It is a much deeper topic than what we're going to clarify here. But what you should know when you ask the question, why did swords become curved? Why did curved swords become popular? Well, what we can tell is if you were to cut someone with a straight sword, and I was looking around for an example of a straight sword, but most of the swords here are curved. If you were to cut someone with a straight sword and you were to hit them, that doesn't really do too much damage. Picture cutting a steak. Picture you're eating dinner and you have a steak on the plate in front of you. When you cut that steak, that skin, that literal piece of body, you don't cut it by chopping at it. No, you cut at it by slicing. And that's an important point in swordsmanship from across time as well. You must slice in order to do much damage with the blade, with the edge. So because of that, if you were to have a straight sword, you would have to have a little bit of extra training or practice to cut and then either push or pull to have that blade actually do damage. This is not going to do much. That will be doing much. So how does that come into play with a curved sword? If you were to give someone who's inexperienced with a blade, maybe a new recruit in the military, maybe a new recruit for your pirate ship, whatever the situation, if they are untrained, they are going to do much better, much faster with a curved sword. The reason being, because, keeping in mind what we said before about slicing, you will have to cut, and then the natural curve of the blade allows for a much easier draw across the fleshy bits that you're wanting to cut. So the curved sword helps new recruits or inexperienced people do much better. Plus, it looks cool, and we have to keep that in mind, aside from just the fact that it does look cool. The pirates were a lot about looks. You see the Jolly Roger, you see their rugged appearance. They were all about intimidation, and if they have to show that off in their weapons, then so be it. Those are theories. I want to clarify. It's a hotly debated topic about why curved swords became popular. But I do want to point out that this and most of the weapons of a curved variety that a pirate would be used for infantry. As opposed to a saber, such as one like this up here, which, as it so happens, is a 1800s sword from Mexico. This one is a cavalry saber. It's made for horseback, and it's much longer. This would be useful because if you're on a horse, you have to have a little bit of extra reach to attack the enemies down on the ground. as opposed to, you can see this infantry sword is much shorter than the cavalry sword is. So it's much more wieldy on foot, as opposed to this long, heavier one, not necessarily heavy, but heavier, would be used for horseback. I'm going to put this guy away before we talk about our next sword. So, we talked about both ends of the spectrum. We talked about the thrust-oriented small sword, earlier, the triangular blade, which sacrifices all concepts of cutting for maximizing stabbing. And then we have the cutlass, or hanger, or cutto, or whatever you want to refer to it as, which focuses on cutting ability rather than stabbing. So we have stabbing with the small sword and cutting with the cutlass. But there's a third type of sword in there too. And we have one on the wall as well. Let me grab that. This one right here. Now this one is almost certainly much later than the Pirate Age, but its design is based on one that came out in the late 1700s, and the concept was around at the time as well. This one, this particular blade, is straight and light like a small sword, but it also has a blade on the side. It's not a triangular crossguard, it's a flat crossguard, so that not only can you stab with it, but you can also cut with it. It's kind of your in-between, your middleman, your jack of all trades, but in my opinion, master of none. It's a type of sword that's called a spadrune. It's not a small sword, it's not a cutlass, it's a spadrune. So if you were a pirate that wanted to be able to both thrust at your opponents and cut them at the same time, the spadrune is the weapon for you. And again, this spadrune has a brass guard, which again would be very common, not just for beating the weather and the elements and keeping your sword in relatively good condition without ludicrous amounts of maintenance and upkeep, but it's also fairly cheap. Brass is not an especially rare metal, it's not especially difficult to work, so it becomes what would essentially be your cheap, your layman's weapon, which is just perfect for the pirates, unless they really wanted to splurge on a weapon for their wealth after a successful pirate raid. Brass would be a very popular one too. With that, we get to what would essentially be the end of the Pirate Age. Very simply put, the pirates would become... Piracy would become a very difficult occupation to actually make money in at this time. The English would become much more important, would put much more military force into their New World colonies. You also have this the colonies of England up in North America, which would eventually become the United States, having a much more organized political force that communicated with one another along the coastal towns. And you also have the concept of the merchant marine coming into play as well, meaning the merchants that would used to travel across the ocean undefended now would be sent with would either be a part of the Navy or have a contingent of naval officers with them, such as Marines or sailors, as well as many specialized pirate hunters as part of the English Navy who specialized in going out and hunting down these pirate crews. Piracy, and I want to clarify that, piracy did not end. Piracy has never ended. We have pirates today. But the golden age of piracy was ended when these European forces, and later on American forces, realized the importance of naval trade, especially an unhindered naval trade where the merchants didn't have to worry about their shipments being raided by pirates all the time, and put forth the effort both to diminish piracy in their communities as well as combat piracy on the high seas. Piracy was still around, even in the 1800s, piracy was still around, and it continued to this day. You even see stories of piracy in Africa and other places as well. Now, this story that we talked about today focused on pirates in the Caribbean. Keep in mind, there were pirates all over the place. Pirates in Madagascar, pirates in the Indian Ocean, pirates in Asia. You also have the Waiku pirates from Japan and the Japanese-Chinese region as well, which have their own unique history and story and weaponry behind them as well. The golden age of piracy, specifically the pirates in the Caribbean, are not the only pirates that we should pay attention to in today's day and age. There are pirates all over the place with their own unique history, and they all are, I suppose you'd say, figures or representations of anarchy, of living on your own, of being free of all responsibility and obligation. They're also horrible, atrocious people who tortured and killed for their own financial wealth and gain, usually throwing caution to the wind, usually throwing morality to the wind, rules of war to the wind, and just did whatever it took so that they could go back to their pirate safe haven and party and drink, and then go back and do it all again. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, to heroify these pirates, when in reality they were very much villains as well. So keep that in mind. I highly recommend researching these pirates and their history, and especially the culture and the weaponry that came out of this lifestyle that was born of this ludicrously wealthy frontier island nation, or nations that came out of the colonies. It's incredibly fascinating, and you can check out all sorts of books on the subject at your local library, especially the Kent District Library, which has branches all over the Grand Rapids area, the Grand Rapids, West Michigan area. So I highly recommend checking that out. And a special thanks to the Kent District Library for hosting this presentation of the Swordsmanship Museum and Academy. If you would like to see more, please stay tuned. I know that we've got more presentations coming. If you have questions about anything that you saw today, please comment in wherever you saw this video, YouTube, Facebook. We will be monitoring it for many months. So even if you're watching it long after it was originally posted, we will still be monitoring it, and we will still be answering these questions to help you on your path towards historical learning, historical knowledge, and the wealth of understanding that brings. Once more, this is Jerry from the Swordsmanship Museum and Academy, presenting